Johnny Carson ruled late night for 30 years, but not every guest was welcome. Behind his charming smile and quick wit, Carson had a list of celebrities he absolutely couldn't stand. Some betrayed his trust, others hijacked his show, and a few even dared to intimidate the king of late night himself. From comedy legends who crossed the line to Hollywood icons who brought chaos to his carefully controlled set, these 10 guests pushed Carson to his limits. Here are the celebrities that Johnny Carson genuinely hated having on The Tonight Show. Bob Hope, the legendary comedian who entertained troops and dominated Hollywood for decades, became one of Johnny Carson's most dreaded guests on The Tonight Show. The problem wasn't Hope's legacy or his status as comedy royalty. It was his complete inability to adapt to modern television that drove Carson absolutely crazy. By the time Hope was making regular appearances in the 70s and 80s, he'd transformed from a quick-witted entertainer into what Carson privately called a walking cue card reader who couldn't hold a genuine conversation if his life depended on it. Hope would arrive at the studio with an entourage of writers who'd send over pre-written jokes and specific talking points days in advance, essentially demanding that Carson follow a script for what should have been a spontaneous interview. This rigid approach turned Carson from the master of late night into nothing more than a straight man setting up Hope's dusty punchlines. What really frustrated Carson was watching other comedy legends like George Burns and Jack Benny come on the show and still engage in natural, hilarious banter, while Hope insisted on delivering jokes that felt decades out of date. The Tonight Show thrived on authentic moments and unexpected exchanges, but Hope treated every appearance like he was performing at a carefully rehearsed USO show from 1945. Carson's producer, Peter LaSalle, later revealed that the entire staff dreaded Hope's appearances, but they felt obligated to book him because of his legendary status and connections in Hollywood. The segments were so painfully stiff that Carson would visibly tense up during the introductions, knowing he was about to spend 20 minutes pulling teeth trying to get anything resembling genuine conversation from Hope. Even worse, Hope would often ignore Carson's questions entirely, launching into prepared anecdotes that had nothing to do with what was being discussed. The final straw came when Hope started bringing his own cue cards to read from during interviews, completely abandoning any pretense of spontaneous conversation. Carson, who prided himself on making television feel alive and immediate, found Hope's appearances to be everything he fought against in modern entertainment, turning what should have been engaging television into a museum piece that viewers endured rather than enjoyed. Joan Rivers, the sharp-tongued comedian who became Carson's chosen successor, committed what Johnny considered the ultimate betrayal in show business history. Carson had discovered Rivers, nurtured her career, and made her a household name through nearly 200 appearances on The Tonight Show. She wasn't just a frequent guest, she was family to Carson, serving as his permanent guest host throughout the early 80s when he took time off. Their relationship was built on genuine mutual respect and affection. Carson saw in Rivers the same quick wit and fearless humor that made him successful, and he groomed her as the natural heir to his late-night throne. Rivers would often joke that Carson was like a father to her, and he treated her with the kind of professional generosity that was rare in Hollywood. He gave her the platform to develop her voice, test material, and build the confidence that would define her legendary career. But in 1986, everything changed when Rivers accepted Fox's offer to host her own competing late-night show. The betrayal wasn't just that she took the job, it was how she handled it. Rivers never told Carson directly about the offer or her decision to accept it. Instead, Carson found out from network executives that his hand-picked protege was going head-to-head against him in the same time slot. When Rivers finally tried to call and explain herself, Carson refused to take her calls. The ban that followed was swift and permanent. Carson erased Rivers from The Tonight Show as if she'd never existed, and the freeze-out lasted for 26 years. Even after Carson retired in 1992, his successor Jay Leno honored the ban out of respect for his predecessor's wishes. Rivers would later admit that losing Carson's friendship was one of her greatest regrets, calling it more painful than any professional setback she'd ever experienced. What made the betrayal particularly devastating for Carson was the personal element. He'd opened doors for Rivers when nobody else would, defended her against critics who said she was too harsh for television, and trusted her with his show. In return, she'd gone behind his back for a bigger paycheck. Rivers didn't return to The Tonight Show until 2014 when Jimmy Fallon took over, and by then, Carson had been gone for 9 years, taking his grudge to the grave without ever speaking to her again. Wayne Newton, the Las Vegas entertainer known for his smooth voice and flamboyant performances, actually intimidated Johnny Carson into submission through a confrontation that became legendary in late-night television history. For years, Carson had made Newton the target of repeated jokes on The Tonight Show, mocking everything from his high-pitched speaking voice to his polished appearance and over-the-top Vegas showmanship. The jokes often carried subtle implications about Newton's masculinity, suggesting he was soft or overly theatrical compared to other entertainers. While most celebrities understood that being roasted by Carson was part of the game, Newton took the relentless mockery personally. He was proud of his success, having built an empire in Las Vegas through hard work and talent, and he didn't appreciate being turned into a punchline night after night. The tension simmered for months until Newton decided he'd had enough of being Carson's punching bag. What happened next became the stuff of Hollywood legend. Newton, who had powerful connections throughout Las Vegas and wasn't afraid to use them, stormed into Carson's NBC office unannounced. According to multiple witnesses, Newton didn't come for a polite discussion. He physically loomed over Carson, using his imposing presence to deliver a clear message that the jokes needed to stop immediately. Some accounts suggest Newton grabbed Carson by the collar, while others say he simply made it crystal clear through his demeanor that there would be serious consequences if the mockery continued. Carson, who was known for his cool demeanor and never backing down from a comedic target, was reportedly visibly shaken by the encounter. This wasn't some angry letter or phone call from a publicist. This was a face-to-face confrontation with a man who had the connections and determination to follow through on his threats. The usually unflappable Carson found himself completely out of his element, dealing with someone who refused to play by the usual rules of celebrity culture. After the incident, the jokes about Newton mysteriously disappeared from Carson's monologues. While Carson never publicly acknowledged the confrontation, those close to the show noticed the dramatic shift. Newton's appearances on The Tonight Show afterward were noticeably tense, with Carson maintaining strict professionalism but clearly uncomfortable. The message had been received loud and clear, making Newton one of the only celebrities to successfully intimidate Johnny Carson into silence through sheer force of will. Mr. Rogers, the beloved children's television host, created some of the most awkward moments in Tonight Show history simply by being himself. Fred Rogers was everything Johnny Carson wasn't: soft-spoken, deeply sincere, and completely devoid of sarcasm or irony. While millions adored Rogers for his gentle approach to children's education, his appearances on Carson's show were painful exercises in incompatibility that left Carson visibly struggling to find his comedic footing. The fundamental problem was that Rogers operated on an entirely different wavelength from Carson's typical guests. Where Carson thrived on witty banter, playful teasing, and sophisticated adult humor, Rogers brought earnest discussions about feelings, childhood development, and the importance of kindness. There was simply no way for Carson to deploy his usual arsenal of jokes without looking like he was bullying America's most wholesome television personality. Carson's discomfort was obvious whenever Rogers appeared. The usually smooth host would shift in his chair, his timing would falter, and his famous ability to find humor in any situation completely abandoned him. Rogers would answer questions with such genuine thoughtfulness that Carson couldn't find an opening for his trademark quips. When Rogers talked about helping children process difficult emotions or the value of imagination, Carson had nowhere to go comedically without appearing cruel or cynical. What made these appearances particularly challenging was Rogers' complete inability or unwillingness to engage in the typical talk show dance of self-promotion and calculated charm. He didn't tell funny anecdotes about celebrity encounters or share amusing behind-the-scenes stories. Instead, he discussed the importance of self-worth or explained why he chose to address divorce on his children's show, leaving Carson nodding along awkwardly while the studio audience sat in respectful but confused silence. The energy drain was palpable whenever Rogers sat in the guest chair. Carson's show was built for laughs, surprises, and entertainment, but Rogers brought the tempo to a crawl with his measured speaking style and refusal to participate in anything resembling show business banter. Even Carson's attempts at genuine conversation fell flat because Rogers' sincerity made everything feel like a Sunday school lesson rather than late-night entertainment. While Carson maintained professional respect for Rogers and his work, staff members later revealed that he dreaded these bookings, knowing he'd spend the entire segment fighting against his natural instincts while trying not to offend America's favorite neighbor. Charlton Heston, the legendary actor who commanded the screen in biblical epics and historical dramas, brought an intensity to The Tonight Show that made Carson deeply uncomfortable. Heston approached every appearance like he was delivering the Ten Commandments rather than promoting his latest film, carrying himself with such self-importance that Carson struggled to find any comedic openings in their conversations. The fundamental clash came from Heston's complete inability to laugh at himself or engage in the playful banter that made Carson's interviews sparkle. While other Hollywood legends could poke fun at their own images, Heston treated every question as if he were testifying before Congress. His answers were long-winded dissertations about the craft of acting, the importance of classical training, or the historical significance of whatever role he'd just played. Carson would try to lighten the mood with gentle jokes, only to watch them die against Heston's stone-faced seriousness. What really frustrated Carson was Heston's tendency to turn every conversation into a lecture. Ask him about a movie, and he'd deliver a 15-minute monologue about the societal importance of cinema. Mention his famous roles, and he'd launch into scholarly discussions about ancient Rome or biblical history. The Tonight Show was supposed to be entertainment, not a university seminar, but Heston seemed incapable of understanding the difference. The situation worsened when Heston became president of the NRA and started using his appearances to deliver political sermons. Carson, who carefully avoided alienating any portion of his audience, found himself trapped between Heston's increasingly partisan speeches and his responsibility to keep the show politically neutral. Heston would arrive ready to debate gun rights or conservative values, while Carson just wanted to get a few laughs and move on to the next segment. Staff members later revealed that Carson would actually groan when he saw Heston's name on the guest list. The pre-interview meetings were apparently torturous, with Heston insisting on discussing serious topics, while the producers desperately tried to find something, anything, that might lead to an entertaining television moment. Carson once privately joked that interviewing Heston was like trying to do comedy with Mount Rushmore, all gravitas and no give. While Carson maintained his professional composure on camera, those close to the show knew that Heston represented everything Carson tried to avoid in a guest: pretension, inflexibility, and an exhausting inability to recognize that late-night television was supposed to be fun. Harry Belafonte, the Calypso sensation and civil rights activist, frustrated Carson by refusing to treat The Tonight Show as entertainment, instead using every appearance as a platform for political activism. While Belafonte was undeniably talented and his day-o had made him a household name, his appearances on Carson's show became increasingly tense as he insisted on steering every conversation toward racial injustice, poverty, and social inequality. The problem wasn't that Carson disagreed with Belafonte's causes, but rather that the singer seemed incapable of understanding the show's purpose. Audiences tuned in late at night for laughs and light entertainment after a long day, not lectures about systemic oppression. Belafonte would come on to promote an album or concert, and within minutes he'd be discussing segregation in the South or American foreign policy in developing nations. Carson would try to redirect with humor or shift to safer topics, but Belafonte would forcefully drag the conversation back to his activism. What made these appearances particularly uncomfortable was Belafonte's intensity and his unwillingness to match the show's tone. He'd sit forward in his chair, his voice rising with passion as he discussed injustices, while Carson sat back trying to figure out how to transition to a commercial break without seeming dismissive of important issues. The studio audience, expecting comedy and celebrity gossip, would shift uncomfortably in their seats as Belafonte turned the show into a sociology lecture. Carson's frustration was evident in his body language during these segments. He'd tap his pencil more frequently, his smile would become fixed and artificial, and he'd glance at his producers off camera with a look that clearly said, "Help me out here." The careful balance Carson maintained to avoid alienating any portion of his diverse audience was constantly threatened by Belafonte's determination to make political statements. Behind the scenes, producers tried to prep Belafonte about keeping things light, but he'd agree, and then immediately launch into discussions about inequality once the cameras rolled. Carson once reportedly told his staff that interviewing Belafonte was like trying to host a variety show in the middle of a protest march. While Carson respected Belafonte's convictions and his courage in fighting for civil rights, he resented having his entertainment program hijacked for political purposes. The Tonight Show was Carson's carefully controlled kingdom, where he decided the tone and topics, and Belafonte's refusal to play by those rules made him one of Carson's most challenging and frustrating guests. Chevy Chase, the original Saturday Night Live breakout star, brought such a toxic combination of arrogance and neediness to The Tonight Show that Carson could barely hide his contempt. Chase had rocketed to fame as SNL's first weekend update anchor, and by the time he was appearing on Carson's show, he'd developed a reputation as one of the most difficult people in Hollywood. His appearances were masterclasses in how to irritate Johnny Carson without technically doing anything wrong. The core issue was Chase's desperate need to prove he was funnier than Carson, while simultaneously wanting Carson's approval and validation. He'd sit in the guest chair delivering his prepared bits with a smug expression, constantly trying to top Carson's jokes rather than engaging in actual conversation. When Carson would set up a story or make an observation, Chase would immediately jump in with what he thought was a funnier punchline, killing the natural rhythm of the interview. What really grated on Carson was Chase's transparent positioning of himself as the heir apparent to late-night television. Chase would make subtle and not-so-subtle references to his own future in television, dropping hints about his availability for hosting duties. This presumptuous behavior from someone who'd been famous for about 5 minutes compared to Carson's decades of dominance was both insulting and laughable. Carson had seen dozens of young comedians come through claiming to be the future, but Chase's combination of arrogance and obvious insecurity made him particularly insufferable. The physical comedy that made Chase famous on SNL also became a source of tension. He'd frequently fall off his chair or do pratfalls during interviews, desperate for laughs but misjudging the Tonight Show audience entirely. Carson's humor was sophisticated and verbal, while Chase was still doing Gerald Ford impressions and slapstick routines that felt juvenile in the context of Carson's elegant show. Behind the scenes, Carson would reportedly mock Chase's desperate need for attention, doing cruel but accurate impressions of the younger comedian's preening behavior. The Tonight Show staff knew to keep Chase's appearances brief, because extended segments would lead to increasingly awkward moments as Chase tried harder and harder to impress Carson, who responded with barely concealed disdain. Carson once told a producer that watching Chase try to be funny was like watching someone drown while insisting they were actually swimming. The generational clash between Carson's effortless cool and Chase's sweaty ambition made for some of the most uncomfortable television of Carson's career. Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board himself, wielded his massive ego like a weapon whenever he appeared on The Tonight Show, turning Carson's carefully orchestrated program into The Sinatra Show whether Carson liked it or not. While Sinatra's star power guaranteed huge ratings, his appearances were exercises in barely controlled chaos that left Carson struggling to maintain his authority as host. The most infamous incident occurred when Sinatra simply walked onto the set during Carson's monologue, completely unannounced and uninvited, interrupting a joke mid-punchline. The audience erupted in applause while Carson stood there, his timing destroyed, forced to smile and pretend he was delighted by the interruption. Sinatra knew exactly what he was doing. It was a power move designed to show everyone who the real star was. And Carson had no choice but to play along or risk looking petty in front of millions. Sinatra's appearances came with a traveling circus of demands and disruptions. He'd arrive with an entourage of cronies who would take over the green room, making noise and treating the NBC studios like their personal clubhouse. The production staff would be given lists of topics that were off-limits, questions that couldn't be asked, and specific requirements for everything from the lighting to the temperature of his drinking water. Carson, who ran his show with military precision, found himself forced to accommodate a guest who recognized no authority but his own. What really bothered Carson was Sinatra's habit of hijacking interviews to settle scores or make pronouncements. He'd used Carson's show as his personal platform to attack journalists who'd written unflattering articles, to make veiled threats against enemies, or to deliver rambling monologues about respect and loyalty that had nothing to do with whatever Carson was trying to discuss. The host would sit there, his famous composure being tested, while Sinatra turned The Tonight Show into his own personal soapbox. The tension between them was palpable, despite the surface friendliness. Carson needed Sinatra for their ratings and prestige, while Sinatra enjoyed using Carson's platform to remind everyone of his power. Staff members later revealed that Carson would be noticeably on edge before Sinatra appearances, knowing he was about to spend 30 minutes pretending to be in charge while Sinatra did whatever he wanted. Carson once privately admitted that interviewing Sinatra was like being a lion tamer who knew the lion didn't actually respect the whip. Bette Midler, the divine Miss M herself, brought such overwhelming energy and emotion to The Tonight Show that Carson often looked like he was hanging on for dear life rather than hosting his own program. While their on-air chemistry produced some memorable moments, including her legendary final appearance where she sang Carson to tears, their relationship was marked by an uncomfortable dynamic that left Carson feeling steamrolled by her presence. Midler has openly discussed how cold Carson was to her off-camera, speculating that he found her confidence and brashness intimidating. She was right. Carson, who came from an era when women guests were expected to be charming and deferential, didn't know how to handle Midler's hurricane-force personality. She'd sweep onto the set like she owned it, telling bawdy jokes, belting out songs without warning, and completely disrupting the careful pacing Carson worked so hard to maintain. The problem was that Midler refused to be controlled or directed. When Carson tried to steer conversations, she'd barrel right through his attempts, launching into wild stories about her bathhouse performances or her latest feuds with other celebrities. She'd touch him constantly during interviews, grabbing his arm, patting his knee, invading his personal space in ways that made the notoriously reserved Carson visibly uncomfortable. His body would stiffen, his smile would become forced, and he'd lean away from her enthusiastic gesticulations. What really bothered Carson was how Midler's appearances became the Bette Midler Show rather than The Tonight Show. She'd perform elaborate numbers that went on forever, turning his desk into a stage, using his show as her personal concert venue. During her famous final appearance in 1992, she literally sat on his desk, singing directly to him. An intimate moment that moved him to tears, but also represented everything that made him uncomfortable about her. The invasion of his space, the emotional intensity, the complete takeover of his show. Staff members noted that Carson would seem exhausted after Midler's appearances, like he'd just gone 10 rounds in a boxing ring. While he respected her immense talent and recognized the entertainment value she brought, her refusal to dial down her personality or respect the traditional host-guest dynamic left him feeling like a supporting player on his own show. Carson once reportedly said that interviewing Midler was like trying to have a conversation in a hurricane. You just held on and hoped you'd still be standing when it was over. Don Rickles, the master of insult comedy, was simultaneously Carson's favorite headache and most reliable chaos agent on The Tonight Show. While their relationship was built on genuine mutual respect and produced legendary television moments, Rickles had a unique ability to completely demolish Carson's control over his own show, turning the host into a target for relentless mockery that occasionally crossed from playful to genuinely uncomfortable. The fundamental issue was that Rickles recognized no boundaries and followed no rules. He'd storm onto the set like a comedic tornado, insulting Carson's suit, his hair, his Midwest background, and anything else he could target. While Carson usually gave as good as he got, there were moments when Rickles' barrage of insults would hit too close to home, touching on Carson's divorces, his drinking, or his legendary difficulty with personal relationships. The audience would laugh, but Carson's smile would tighten just enough to show the joke had landed harder than intended. What really drove Carson crazy was Rickles' complete disregard for the show's format. He'd get up from the guest chair without warning, wander into the audience to insult people, or start rifling through Carson's desk drawers looking for material to mock. The famous incident where Rickles broke Carson's cigarette box while guest hosting became comedy legend, but it also perfectly illustrated the problem. Rickles treated The Tonight Show set like his personal playground, and Carson had to just sit there and take it, or risk looking like he couldn't handle the heat. The unpredictability factor was exhausting for Carson, who liked knowing where conversations were heading. With Rickles, anything could happen. He might suddenly turn on Ed McMahon, start roasting the band, or launch into an impression of Carson that was just accurate enough to be uncomfortable. Carson would find himself playing defense for entire segments, trying to get in a word while Rickles machine gunned jokes at everyone in sight. Despite the chaos, Carson kept booking Rickles because the audiences loved the mayhem. But staff members revealed that Carson would need a stiff drink after Rickles' appearances, worn out from trying to maintain some semblance of control while being turned into a punchline on his own show. These Tonight Show tensions remind us that even the smoothest host in television history had his limits. Carson's legendary composure could be shattered by the right combination of ego, chaos, or betrayal. While some of these relationships eventually healed, others left permanent scars on late-night history. Carson's ban on Joan Rivers lasted until his death, proving that behind the affable host was a man who never forgot a slight. Which of these feuds surprised you the most? Did you know about Carson's confrontation with Wayne Newton or his complete ban of Joan Rivers? Let us know in the comments below which Tonight Show moment you found most shocking.